firstly, and as always, welcome to everyone joining us from around the world. We have such a beautiful growing community at the moment of Canadians, folks in the US, obviously plenty of Australians in the mix. Myself, I'm based in Lennox Head, New South Wales, and our lovely presenter today, Dr. Kaitlin Harkess, is joining us from South Australia via Cranbrook, Canada, which is very exciting. So she's got a bit of a connection to a few continents here. And welcome to our lovely community members in Europe and the Middle East and Canada, the US, who aren't joining us right now because of the time zone, but are watching this replay. So thank you and welcome. So today's session, we begin diving into resilience. And resilience is going to be a focus for us at Human Leaders over the next about 2 months. We've got 4 sessions coming up, all centered around resilience in a different way and from a different perspective. And the reason I wanted to bring this concept of resilience into the mix early in the year for us is, in my experience, I find a lot of leaders and a lot of businesses tackle resilience when the wheels have already started falling off the bus in their organization or for them personally. And resilience, when we tackle this or when we strategize for this in a preventative way, we can actually start to build a stronger, more robust foundation, both as an individual leader and as an organization, before it gets to breaking point, before the wheels start falling off the bus and before it becomes like a contingency plan to deal with bigger issues. So when we talk about resilience, there are a few different definitions obviously floating around about what resilience is, the most common one being the ability to bounce back. And most recently, I was introduced to the definition created by the team at Driven, who you'll be hearing from in February. And their definition of resilience is advancing despite adversity, which I really, really love as well. And I think helps us paint this more preventative picture of how we can use resilience and how we can build a robustness in face of things like challenges. So one of the domains of resilience, and this is particularly pertinent to us as an individual leader, but that is our own individual health and well-being. And I see often that leaders don't always make this link between how they treat themselves and how they take care of themselves personally, and how this is inextricably linked to their ability to lead effectively. So with that said, the very first session, today's session that we'll be diving into around resilience, really looks at this through the individual lens. And Dr. Harkess will be speaking to us about how we can cultivate flexible resiliency using mindful movement. So it starts to help us understand from an individual perspective, what are some of the mitigating things that we can do? What are some of the foundations that we can put in place to make us as an individual more resilient and therefore more capable of showing up in a resilient way in our leadership, and that filtering through into our organizations as well. So before I hand over to Dr. Harkess, I'm just going to run you through a little bit more about her first. So Dr. Kaitlin Harkess is a registered clinical psychologist and a senior yoga instructor who is passionate about supporting individuals to live intentional lives that align with their deepest values. So for me, Dr. Harkess really helps us start to connect these dots between what we've already covered so far in this year's sessions around value alignment, and then also start to tie this in with resilience strategies for helping us stay aligned to those moving forward. So Kaitlin is particularly interested in integrative psychology approaches and completed a PhD research exploring the practice of yoga as a tool to support individuals experiencing chronic stress and symptoms of anxiety and depression. So Kaitlin deeply values integrity and believes that the importance that individuals can access psychological well-being tools that are actually evidence-based. So in alignment with this, Kaitlin hosts the weekly Wisdom for Wellbeing podcast, which is actually how I found Kaitlin, and I reached out to her via Instagram after really resonating with her content. And she's developed a modern psychological course called Yoga Brain 101, where she teaches psychological flexibility skills alongside specifically designed mindful movement practices at www.drkaitlin.com. So Kaitlin runs a boutique private psychology practice in Adelaide, and she enjoys sharing these resources both on Instagram and Facebook. So it brings me great pleasure to bring Kaitlin into the mix for us today. She's going to be driving this workshop on cultivating flexible resilience through mindful movement. And again, I encourage your questions. I encourage your insights as the session goes. Please do pop those into the chat. And at the end of the session with Kaitlin, we'll move through some of those as a group. So thank you for joining us today, Kaitlin, and welcome.
Thank you so much for having me, Alexis, and thank you all for being here, creating this space. I know that time is our most precious resource, the one that we don't get back. So it is very much my intention to maximize the time investment today. And I am, as Alexis sort of said, super happy for questions to come along the way. That's not going to throw me at all. So feel free to pop them in as they arise, and we can kind of navigate and make sure the content answers any queries and troubleshoots any challenges that you might be experiencing or that you might kind of get the sense are coming up along the way. Now, without further ado, I will share my screen. So we tried this earlier. It should be smooth sailing, and I'll just flick this over. There we go. So here we are. So we're talking about cultivating flexible resilience with mindful movement skills. Now, I say mindful movement skills because yoga is very formulaic, and I will use that term as we go on. But ultimately, what we're talking about here is moving our bodies mindfully. Mindfulness is such a buzzword right now. I have absolutely no doubt that you've heard all about the practice of mindfulness and how it can support everything from your physical health, your focus, your attention, to your emotional well-being. And if we pair it with movement, we're going to get the benefit of both. But to really talk about what I mean by flexibility, I love this quote. Blessed are the flexible, for they shall not be bent out of shape. I think this is really important because when we say this, at least from where I stand and from the framework I'll be sharing with you today, we're not talking about touching our toes. I think this really pairs with that driven definition that Alex has just shared around resilience, because if we're advancing despite adversity, it means that we're being flexible. Adversity, challenges come up in life, and this is part of being human, which ultimately, this is what it's all about, right? Human leaders. So we need to accept that challenges are going to arise for us, both internally in terms of our state, you know, the thoughts, feelings, experiences we have. How are we able to respond to these things skillfully to move forward in a really clear, driven manner that is values aligned and values directed? So I've already been introduced. We won't spend too much time on this slide, but my name is Kaitlin, and this is really my area of passion. I came to psychology through yoga. So I was actually doing a very practical philosophy degree back in Canada. And I started practicing yoga for some organized stretching essentially. And I found these moments of peace. So I started practicing more and more, and other areas in my life started to change. And in terms of getting where I've got today, I don't know that I would have been able to do it without the enhanced attentional skills that I really attribute to yoga and then to my meditation practice, as well as this ability to maintain, you know, a sense of vitality and energy physically that allows my brain to think clearly, you know, and to move forwards. And stress. So I just want to start our conversation here because often when we talk about needing resilience, it's in the face of stress, you know, challenges that come up. And I want to make sure that we're really clear on what stress is, because sometimes we consider stress to be a negative thing. And I imagine that doesn't actually align with all of your experiences, because the fact of the matter is we need a little bit of stress to achieve. You know, a little bit of stress would have had you get up to your alarm this morning, That meeting reminder would have had you get into this session now. A little bit of stress gets your projects done. We need stress in our lives, and we've probably all had the experience where we got to holidays and had this idea of all of these tasks we might accomplish, but there were no firm pressures on our time, and we got like zilch done over the course of those holidays. This is the challenge. When we don't have enough stress, not much happens. When we have a reasonable amount of stress, and I'll introduce the frame of eustress, eu is the Greek prefix for good. When we have a good amount of stress, our performance increases. We are able to achieve more and more effectively. When we've got more on our plates than we feel we have the resources for, we end up tipping then over into distress. And this is what we often see in the media, really, is distress being the challenge that impacts our physical and our psychological health. This is when we might start experiencing symptoms of anxiety and depression, and we become less effective. So you can imagine a U curve. On the far left, we might see that our performance level is very low as our stress level is very low. When we meet the middle zone, our stress levels are moderate, our performance goes right up, and we come down the curve on the other side. When our stress levels are too high, we're entering a state of distress and our performance is compromised. So I would like you to kind of honor the stress, the eustress that you experience in your life, and allow yourself the space to move into those zones. You know, we don't necessarily want to get rid of stress in our lives. We want to be able to respond to it effectively. And we know that when we are experiencing very high stress for an extended period of time, perhaps chronic stress, that can push us into a state of clinical anxiety. So there's anxiety that's normal, part and parcel of this being human. And there is anxiety that we go, this actually is really impacting now on our quality of life in different domains. High stress, clinical anxiety, and then we see a depressive episode happening. So this is data that comes from what we call, longitudinal studies. And what this means is that if we can be aware when our stress levels are starting to get high and maybe starting to tip out of that eustress zone into a state of distress, we can bring practices in to support our well-being, upping our self-care practices and considering what resources we might have to navigate these periods of stress, because it's a lot harder to think when we've started to feel overwhelmingly anxious or really, really flat. We also know that our physiological system is impacted in this state of stress. So what happens is when we are experiencing stress over a long period, our digestive tract is impacted, our ability to take information in from the surrounds in a neutral way is impacted. So something called our hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, which we shorten because it's much more practical to say HPA axis, is impacted, which actually starts to affect our hormones. And this then affects what our body is essentially primed to be looking out for. As you'd probably be well aware, we're in a period of gross uncertainty right now. And I imagine you as leaders are experiencing it in your own work and in those that you are supporting in their journeys, because we have capacity to deal with tough things. We have capacity to respond to stressors. When things are prolonged, when our stress becomes chronic, it's unrelenting, our minds get pretty exhausted. We are continuously coping with the unknown, troubleshooting. And adding to that, we are very interdependent individuals. We should not be the top of the food chain. We do not have the fangs or the claws for it, yet we're here because we learned to work together. We are wired to be connected. It's so important for us to feel like we're connected, we're part of a group, and loneliness is ultimately, the most toxic experience we can have as a human, more toxic than smoking 15 cigarettes a day, if you can believe it. So we need to make sure that we're connected. And in the times of, the pandemic that we are navigating right now, more and more people have perhaps started to feel disconnected. So it's really, we were talking before we started the presentation today that people are starting to go back a little bit more into the office, that we're moving to these hybrid models, but finding creative ways of maintaining connection is paramount for our well-being. And this is why, groups like this are so important, not just in terms of, the thinking power and connection that's brought, but actually for our physical health as well, our security. So bearing this in mind, it's worth kind of holding where we're at, because I don't think we do ourselves any services by kind of pretending we're coping when we're not, or that there are not real challenges we're facing. It's normal to feel stress in times of uncertainty when there are changes to routine. There might be changes to the way we're working. We might be feeling, anxiety about illness and about how we support those around us. So if we hold those, we can have a very real picture of where things are right now. And then we can look at how this reality, as well as situations arising internally and externally, affects us. So I know that you've all heard of the fight, flight, or freeze response, but I will introduce it once more just to make sure that we're all on the same page with our understanding here. So when we experience a stressor, a challenge, what our mind might label as a threat, our heart rate starts going. Our heart rate starts going because we're pumping more blood to our arms and our legs. And then we start breathing quicker because we need to oxygenate that blood. That extra blood that's going to our arms and our legs is coming from our digestive tract and from our prefrontal cortex, the front part of our brain that allows us to do high-level problem solving. This reaction makes a lot of sense if there's a tiger chasing us and we just need to get away. We need to flee, or, we might want to try and fight. Who knows how that would go? But the system makes a lot of sense evolutionarily speaking. However, a lot of the stressors, the challenges that we face now are not those that we are running or fleeing from. Yet everything in our nervous system is telling us to do just that. And what this can mean is that we avoid, whether it's suddenly cleaning our fridge out when we have a big project due, or some people might avoid in different ways, finding a bottle of pills or wine, whatever it is for the individual. Knowing our avoidance patterns is really helpful, because then we might notice there's something going on for us at a biological level, that we're having this stress response. That cycle is also really difficult because we have this tendency as humans, and I think particularly individuals who use their intellect regularly, great problem solvers, right? So suddenly you're feeling really uncomfortable and you want to use the prefrontal cortex, the front part of your brain, to problem solve why you're feeling so uncomfortable and how you can get out of this. And the challenge is, number one, that there's just not a lot of blood there, so it's going to be more difficult to do. But number two, we can't problem solve our emotional states. Being able to act flexibly involves being able to be okay with our emotional state, whatever it is, even when it's uncomfortable, and to still act in alignment with our values. In order to do that, we need to know what we're feeling. And this is something we're not necessarily taught how to do in our society, in a society that says, oh, toughen up, you're fine, get over it. Oh, it's not that bad. Don't cry. We've been getting these messages since we were quite young. So in a way, we've learned that our emotions are too much and that we can't cope if we feel them. And I wonder how that impacts our ability to be resilient if we're essentially using a gross amount of energy to disconnect from our emotional experience, our physical experience, our internal experience. And this is why yoga can be so useful, because a lot of us, when we are in a state of overwhelm, or we're quite busy, kind of action movement orientated individuals, sitting down and meditating may feel less accessible to us. So these more traditional forms of mindfulness and meditation, where we see someone sitting down looking all zen, might not feel totally in line with our natural way of being in the beginning. For some of us, it might be more easeful. Yet yoga brings us the effect, the benefit, the experience of mindfulness, of meditation. It also brings in breathing as well as physical activity. So mindfulness, breathing, and physical activity are three incredible and evidence-based practices for stress reduction. So if you are looking to stay in that state of eustress, to be able to maintain your energy, your clarity, and your focus, how do we keep you in that zone in the context of stressors, challenges accumulating that could be tempting you out of the zone into a state of distress? How do we bring these practices together? And yoga is one easeful way. It can be practiced at home. And I also believe that you can incorporate into a yoga practice, clarity in your values, bringing into your practice a sense of intention, of purposefulness. What is it that this practice might align with for you? And I find, as a bit of a nerd myself, it's useful to know some of the benefits, because for me, that's really motivational. So knowing that not only does yoga support your psychological well-being, but if you do suffer any chronic pain, there's an established body of research that supports yoga's use in this, as well as for cardiovascular conditions, autoimmune conditions, and immune conditions. And I think this has relevance kind of given current context. Knowing that yoga can enhance your mood, decrease your anxiety and your stress is motivation to show up onto the mat, but perhaps you wonder why. And this is where it gets really interesting, because there's been some research looking at yoga, number one, turning on your parasympathetic nervous system. So where we talked about your rest and digest response, that is governed through your sympathetic nervous system. It's really generally a pretty unconscious response. Your parasympathetic nervous system is kind of the balance to it, the brakes, so to speak. And we might call this your rest and digest response. If we are able to activate our rest and digest response, if we're able to activate our parasympathetic nervous system regularly, what it means is that we can put on the brakes when that sympathetic nervous system takes hold more quickly, more efficiently. So it doesn't mean that you'll never experience stress or overwhelm, but it means that you can slow down that biopsychophysiological response. So if you can brake more easily, your system is going to experience less wear and tear, which is, number one, going to feel a lot more easeful, but it's going to keep you online, keep you focused in your work with where you want to go, what you want to achieve, if you're not suffering the consequences of ill health, both in body and mind. There's also been some research that suggested through the practice of yoga, we see a change in one's neurochemistry in the brain. And what we're seeing is increased GABA levels. Is an anxiolytic. So it's something that can be prescribed, but it's something that we can naturally induce. If we have more GABA in our brain, it means that challenging situations aren't going to affect us in the way they might have affected us when we had lower levels, or everything else being equal, if that makes sense. Certainly, we all have different resources. We all have different resources in regards to our skill sets, our time, family, friends, different people that can help us out at different opportunities. And we all have different biophysiology. Yet that is one area we can start to make some changes, so that what stressed you yesterday might be different than what stresses you today. It might be our sleep that makes the difference. And again, this is an area where yoga can be helpful too, because we found that through regular movement practices, physical activity, as well as mindfulness and breathing, we see an enhanced ability to turn off the mind in the sense of being able to drift into sleep. So I hope that starts to sell you on why this is an important and useful practice for you in terms of performance and ultimately resilience building. We know that it's all connected, and that healing needs to support your body and your mind, that physical and psychological experiences affect each other. So we can move from the outside in terms of movement, and that will start to transform the mind. And as our mind responds to stressors, challenges differently, that's going to affect what's happening in our body. So we can cultivate resilience from the outside in. And it doesn't mean that, you need to be spending hours on the mat. Yoga is ultimately interrupting your thinking mind in different ways. And it can be, 5 minutes, 10 minutes. And in fact, I really like to share the magic number of 10, because there's been a brilliant amount of research thus far that has suggested, in terms of mindfulness benefit, the optimal dose response ratio is between 8 and 12 minutes. So what that means is, if you invest 10 minutes of your time to practice tuning into the present moment, you're going to see a really big impact over the course of time in your life. Even if you don't have 20 minutes, even if you don't have 30 minutes, 10 minutes is really the optimal amount. And if you don't have 10 minutes, honestly, start with 3 minutes. There are some amazing 3-minute breathing space activities that you can do. And if you become the type of person who practices mindfulness, meditation, or movement for 3 minutes every day, you suddenly become that person. The mindfulness person, the movement person. And then it's a little bit easier to do more and more, because your identity shifts along the way. The thing about identity that we're learning more and more is that it's not fixed. For so long, we talked about personality characteristics like they were fixed and unchangeable. And in fact, modern psychological research is suggesting that we can really alter who we are, so to speak, in terms of coming into alignment with our values and who we choose to be. So if you can choose to start small here, if you can choose to pair 3 breaths with your morning coffee, that's going to be a shift. And it's the same amount with movement. So in terms of the benefit from physical activity, a lot of it comes with getting off the couch, getting out of the chair. 10 minutes is great. 10 minutes is, again, where we're seeing a lot of bang for buck in terms of increasing your heart rate. However, I get it. To get into your sneakers, to roll out the yoga mat in the middle of the day might be challenging. But what's it like to lift your desk? To pile a few books or wind it up, depending on whether you have standing desk access, and to move your body a little bit, to incorporate a stretch, which we could be doing right now. You could literally turn your camera off, be standing, moving around the room while you listen. Are movement, inhaling as one arm goes up, exhaling as the other goes down, or even moving your legs up and down in place. Could this not be yoga? Because essentially, mindful movement is being in the present moment, aware of what's happening in your physical body, aware of your environment, what's happening around you, and integrating breath and movement. So is this not then a yoga practice that you're engaged in? And with that in mind, if we come back to this idea of resilience and flexibility, I really believe that it is flexibility and resilience that will get you through unknowns, get you through challenges, move you from a state of suffering to a state where you feel incredibly vital and alive in your life and can ultimately thrive. Because it is incredibly difficult to thrive if you don't feel like you've got that vital energy, that power that comes with feeling in alignment with who you want to be. Ultimately, you can do hard things when you're on purpose, when you're clear on what you want. I cannot put my hand up for having run a marathon. This is something I hear people do. It doesn't align with my sense as to where I want to be moving in my life, but people do it. And that is something that is incredibly difficult and challenging. And the experience of, for instance, running a marathon is very different than someone who runs umpteen number of kilometers, miles, however we're measuring it, for survival purposes, than someone who actually chooses to do that, chooses to do something really difficult because of what it means about them and their focus and their determination. And it's the same thing in your working life as well, right? No doubt you take on hard projects, challenging projects, projects that push you. And when you know why you're doing that, where you're going, why you're going there, and who you are becoming in going there, you can undoubtedly excel. But having that clarity is important. So this is where I like to introduce the 3 pillars of psychological flexibility that I really believe align with this experience of resilience, being able to bounce back. So the first is awareness. Being able to notice what is showing up for you in the present moment. We can live so much in the future and the past. If we miss what's happening right here, we're often unaware of our emotional states, our thoughts, our feelings, our urges. And if we miss those things, we might end up in behavior that's actually misguided and misaligned in terms of where we want to go. And we might engage in behavior that's actually not helpful. For instance, if we find ourselves suddenly yelling at a loved one or overreacting, what we might see with hindsight, to a team member, we might not have noticed earlier in the day when we were starting to feel a little bit more uncomfortable, a little bit more irritated, frustrated. Suddenly we're like at an anger state and we didn't know where that came from. We need to be really aware of what we're experiencing to respond accordingly and to respond in a way that does feel in alignment with who we want to be showing up as. And this also involves understanding ourselves as something broader than just the here, the now, right? Our thoughts, our feelings. If we understand ourselves and can take perspective on different experiences and our experience through the course of time, it's a much more empowering place to exist. Being able to be open to these experiences as they're unfolding, being able to be open to internal, thoughts, feelings, sensations, experiences, and being able to see them as something separate from ourselves. We can have certain thoughts that don't align with who we are or how we choose to conduct ourselves. And similarly with our emotional state, we can experience some uncomfortable emotions and we can choose to act in a different way if we've got that skill set of being able to be open to them and being able to be accepting of. And with these skills, I believe that you can move to a state of engagement where you are clear on your values and you're clear on the committed action, the action that you choose to engage in each day to move forward and move into the person that you choose to be, to create, the legacy that you want to leave. So again, there's awareness, that present moment connection, and what I call your observing self. I believe these things come up on the yoga mat or in your mindfulness practice or your mindful moving practice, in whatever format that takes, because you can check in what's going on internally and externally. And you can notice this experience of yourself doing these practices, to notice sensations arising, shifting, being in your body is huge. That allows you to notice, if I'm noticing these sensations, I'm not these sensations. If I'm noticing these thoughts, I'm not these thoughts. We get a broader sense of self, and there's a willingness to be with what is showing up. And then engagement. And I know this is really the heart and soul of what you do when you guys come together, and you talk about values and purposeful action and where you want to go. You have this compass in your life then, and that makes it much more purposeful in terms of stepping forward and ensuring behaviors, both in terms of routine and big actions that take you forward. So I'm curious as to whether maybe now you might start to see a role for yoga, a role for mindful movement in terms of how it might support your health, both of body and mind, how it might support you vocationally. And that's a bit of a jump, isn't it, in terms of a yoga practice and your efficacy, your success vocationally. But I wonder if we can start to fill in the blanks, knowing that everything in our life can be very connected if we are purposeful, if we see the relationships. Which, speaking of, relationships, parenting, your citizenship, your community engagement, a sense of spirituality can all link to showing up and moving our bodies. And if you haven't done any mindful movement through the course of our time together yet, I would invite you. You don't have to have the camera on. You can do it below the camera. Could you make some movement in your body? Choose whether you're going to lift your foot off the ground or stretch your shoulders, your neck. And just take a moment and notice what that feels like. What was the intent of doing it? Maybe compliance, because that suggests it, but maybe it was to experiment and to start to notice how a little bit of movement might impact and affect you. And maybe you noticed as you moved your body that you'd been sitting in one position for a really long time, or that maybe you were hungry or thirsty or other things came up that you hadn't noticed before. It's this practice of tuning in. So with that in mind, I'd like to spend a little bit more time now talking about action, because what often gets in the way is not our knowledge, our awareness. It tends to be really practical things, like how do we actually bring a new habit, a new practice into our lives? And it sounds very simplistic. You know, I've written here scheduled it, but this isn't the way habits work, is it? You know, we can schedule something in our diary, and if it doesn't feel like a fire, it can very quickly get washed out, particularly if it's something that takes 20, 30, 40 minutes. I'm curious if mindfulness or mindful movement is sounding like it might support you to cultivate more resilience in the multiple dimensions of your life. How could we integrate it in a really effective way? You know, what might be the smallest little morsel, tiny place to start that we could schedule? You know, is it the case that you have 10 minutes? And if it's not the case, let's not start there. There's been some really cool research that has found that when individuals take a goal, if they're instructed to have that goal, so to make the goal smaller, 50% smaller, they're actually more likely to reach the original goal than those who have the original goal to begin with. So what I mean by that is that motivation is built through success. So action begets action. If you break a goal down smaller and smaller yet, when you reach that first target, you feel a sense of success. That's very motivating, and you're more likely to then go on and continue building up the ladder, taking those steps to achieving what might be seen as the bigger goal or the ultimate goal. So if your goal is at some point in your life in the months ahead to move your body for 10 minutes a day, let's break it down to a couple minutes, a couple breaths. You know, and there are a couple of movement exercises that I can show you now that literally take a couple breaths. You don't have to do them with me. I know cameras might be on. If you would like to, I would invite you. But there's one really easeful one where it's almost like you're reaching out, like you're kind of making a circle with your arms. And with the inhale, you pull the breath in towards you, the hands towards you. And on the exhale, exhaling out. Once more, inhaling in, exhaling out. So there you're pairing breath, movement, and if you choose to tune into what's happening, it can be really helpful in starting to notice your physical state. I find when I'm sitting, definitely my neck, my shoulders take a beating, and you can round in that, start to move a little, stretching, kind of respond to your body's needs, act in compassion towards yourself and what you need physically at that moment, as well as allowing yourself a break. And there's one more I'll show you where it's inhaling your arms up and exhaling down. So inhaling up, exhaling down, inhaling up, exhaling down. And I find, and you'll have to play to see what works for you, I find that one to be really useful because as you're moving your arms up, particularly if you're feeling like you need a boost of energy, it can help you move some energy up and press it down. And I know that sounds a little bit wacky, but if you try it and it works, you might notice your energy changes with your movement changing. So could you theoretically schedule one of those paired movement breath activities? Could you schedule it in your day? And I don't mean schedule it as like 2 p.m. I'm going to do this activity. I actually probably should change my languaging and say pair it. You know, could you pair that when you hear the ding of an email, you do 1 or 2 of those breath cycles, or when you go to get a coffee, you do 1 or 2 of those breath cycles. Or when you get up to go to the toilet, you do 1 or 2 of those breath cycles so that you're actually getting movement through your day, bite-sized amounts. They're not big. They're not going to feel as onerous. And then you start to create habits around that, even just the habit of checking in. Because if you go, whoa, this is feeling different, I'm really off kilter, I'm moving more to that state of distress, knowing that that primes us for burnout. I wonder if at that point you might go, oh, okay, well, maybe tonight I'm going to go for a walk outside. That generally feels really good for me. You know, it just gives you a bit of a warning sign. And then as you go to engage in the activity, you know, this mindful movement practice, this yoga practice, however we want to label it, can you show up with intention? Whether it's on the mat formal or not, it's really up to you. But can you show up with the intention of it being for your self-care, for your flexibility, so that you can show up as a more effective leader, so that you can show up as a more patient parent, so that you can show up as a more compassionate friend, family, community member, so that you can show up more as the person you choose to be. Because if you have that intention, I imagine it's going to align you again and again with who you want to be and cultivate that sense of flexibility and clarity so that we are less likely to become rigid or chaotic in terms of how our day is going. We've got a sense of grounding and anchoring. And remember that practice is not perfection. You know, this is all a practice. If we set our sights on perfection, if we've like written down in our calendar that we're going to be doing these 60-minute yoga practices on our busiest day of the week, it's probably not going to go as smoothly as possible. You know, could we be flexible if we don't meet these goals and instead use them as opportunities to problem solve the way you might support those that you support in a broader sense to problem solve and troubleshoot? And if you miss a day or you miss one of those reminders to engage in practice, could that be, again, an opportunity to go, okay, how do I call this to mind? Do I need a sticky note on my computer screen or whatever might be an effective prompt or reminder for you if it feels helpful? So kind of as we come to the end, we will have some time for question. I'm keeping my eyes on the time so that we can make sure this is, you know, supportive of where you're at. I want to remind you that this good vibes only thing that comes up is so unhelpful. I use the word hoax, but if we're expecting that we're going to feel good all the time, or that resilience is a matter of feeling good all the time, it can become really toxic for us and move into this state of toxic positivity. It's about being able to feel. You know, to feel your feels, to feel when you're struggling, when you're exhausted, when you're burnt out, and then to be able to pivot, to make changes, to fill up your cup so that you can keep moving forward in the direction you choose to. You know, it's about this grace. Ultimately, this idea that we need to feel good all the time or feel happy all the time is really not the experience of being human. You know, how incredible to be able to experience the full range of motions and to be able to choose how you show up as in your life. You know, I think this is important to remind ourselves in terms of our self-talk, and also a little bit to change our languaging when we are supporting each other. Because if someone says they're having a tough time, we can go, wow, like, I hear you. Like, what do you need to be able to effectively cope in this tough time, rather than saying, oh, it's not that bad. Get over it. You know, if we can actually hold space for each other, what effective leadership we have there. So this is really kind of the point where I would like to invite any questions, comments, and troubleshoot and unpack. I believe, if I'm reading the time right, we should have about 10 minutes to kind of talk through together, because ultimately, as I've mentioned, I do believe community is important. And as interdependent beings, I think we can probably troubleshoot and share together a lot more effectively than alone. So does anyone have any reflections, questions, comments? I can see there's things in the chat, but I haven't opened it myself yet. So Alexis, I'll let you field it and kind of navigate how we make best use of this time we have now together.
Yeah, thank you. And Kaitlin, I just want to start by, before we even dive into those questions, just saying thank you. I think for me, what isn't often clear is, you know, yoga for so many is a form of exercise or a form of perhaps associated with fitness and things like this. And I think what you've made really clear today is this idea of the mind-body connection, and how movement is about so many more physiological and neurological processes under, you know, that sit beneath this idea of not just wearing lycra on a yoga mat. It's so much more than that. And it's so much more powerful in helping us manage stress, as you mentioned. So I found it personally very valuable to see more of those links between what movement actually does for us mentally and physically and physiologically than just this idea of a yoga practice. So thank you for that. And I do have some comments and questions coming through in the chat here. And Jim raised a really good point, and I just wanted to, I guess, dive into it a little bit more. And Kaitlin, I thought you covered it so brilliantly in your presentation. And I guess it's this idea of like how we actually package the idea of movement into our day, or how we begin to maybe habit stack this into our day. And I so often in my line of work see so many clients setting really big and really grandiose goals, which are really brilliant in terms of future vision and things like that. But when it comes down to the nitty gritty granular level of, okay, what does this look like every day? Quite often it becomes really difficult in our busy schedules, as you mentioned, to sort of fit this in. And Jim raised a really fantastic point, I think, in this slide and through the presentation rather. And he mentioned that he's been scheduling some of his meetings to finish 5 minutes earlier. So rather than a 30-minute meeting, a 25-minute meeting, and rather than an hour meeting, a 55-minute meeting. And that little time difference is a mental cue for him to use that 5 minutes to do some sort of mindful check-in or mindful movement practice before he then moves into his next meeting. So I thought it was just really worth raising his suggestion and his personal practice there around how he actually integrates that into our work. And again, it just comes back to that. Yeah, how cool. And I just thought it was really pertinent around your suggestion of, chunking it down and not making these things too big so that they feel huge, and that we immediately feel like, oh gosh, I don't have the resources to actually make this an effective change or build this as an effective habit. So I thought that was really great. So Jim, thank you for sharing that. And something else I just wanted to reflect on again through your presentation that I thought was really, really valuable was this distinction between stress being bad. And I think we've for a long time felt that this concept of stress is something that needs to be avoided at all costs. And I myself have fallen into this pitfall of stress avoidance. And it's almost like the antithesis of how we build resilience, right? Because that avoidant behavior in of itself, for me, ends up being more of a stress cycle. I'm stressed about feeling stressed, which creates more stress, rather than this idea that a certain level of stress is necessary to get certain things done, but noticing, having that awareness that you mentioned, to notice when we're hitting our own threshold of going from eustress or acceptable level of stress to distress, and then that long-term chronic stress that then results in things like burnout and depression and things like that. So I just felt like that was a really helpful distinction to make. And I think that this idea of understanding or cultivating our own level of awareness of what is helpful for us is really, really beneficial, because then that kind of sets the scene for us in knowing how to structure these things to support ourselves. So I thought that was just a really great thing I wanted to recap on as well there, Kaitlin.
Yeah, thank you. No, I think that's an important way to frame it.
How do we, as practitioners, perhaps in this space, get corporate leaders to pay attention to this? And what are some ways that we can really effectively get them to start integrating this into their practice? And I think not to start answering the question on Kaitlin's behalf, but I think, Jeffrey, from my perspective as a practitioner, it's really important, firstly, to understand in what language they're going to understand the benefit of what it is we're presenting to them. And I think that's something for me as a practitioner in this space, it's always really important to communicate, is what is the language that these particular corporate leaders speak, and how does this fit with the problems they're trying to solve? So I think that's more our consideration. And then secondly to that, getting a better understanding of the individual context in which they operate, and what it is we're trying to get them to do. For instance, if it's a 10-minute a day mindful movement practice, how will this integrate with what they're already doing in a way that won't feel like it's going to be a lot of effort? Obviously, all change requires some investment of effort, but there's certainly a lot of research around how we might be able to habit stack so that we can make that transition more seamless, and then how we create behavioral cues around that to remind people to practice. Because a lot of the challenge in changing behavior is remembering to actually do the thing. So when they've been living the same corporate lifestyle every day for 20 years of getting their coffee, going straight to work and doing something in a certain way, how do we break that pattern? So that's just my 2 cents from the consulting side of how I would sometimes manage some of those interventions. And I'll let Kaitlin take charge now to talk about perhaps some strategies around how that might actually look within a business. So,
yes, similarly, I think that my thoughts are very aligned with yours, Alexis. And I think it is figuring out what matters to them. So if it is around performance, for instance, or, productivity, you can actually look at, I would probably go hard on the nerd side and find the evidence base that supports whether it's mindful movement, whether it's physical activity, these practices in terms of increasing productivity levels so that people can see sort of a cost benefit. What does 10 minutes buy you in terms of more effective focus outcomes? Like, how do we kind of measure this and kind of look at a ratio around what's invested and what's returned? So that would be the way I would approach it. And we know that psychological flexibility skills are incredibly predictive of vocational performance as well as academic performance. So I think there's a real body of research supporting just the psychological element, and then bringing in movement. We know that physical activity is one of the most effective supports we have in terms of how we are able to maintain focus and attention. And then it would probably relate to sick days as well and other outcome measures that might be useful for leaders.
Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you so much for that answer, Kaitlin. And I think something that is also perhaps pertinent on this, and you mentioned it earlier, Kaitlin, as well, and something that a lot of, Jeffrey, when we get clients coming in this space as well, quite often they're coming to us having self-identified a problem. And quite often they've identified where they are and where they would like to be. So there's a clear gap. So for us, quite often as practitioners, it's working out how we navigate, how we cross that gap. And Kaitlin mentioned it earlier around this concept or the differentiation between goal setting and identity change. And I think that is something that is a really, really powerful tool in helping people to cross that gap. Is rather than focusing on being outcome focused, I want to be, rather than, I want to reach this goal of running a marathon, is I want to become someone who feels physically fit, or I want to become a leader who feels mentally sharp or is able to be emotionally strong. Or in this case, I want to be a leader who's resilient. So what is the identity shift that needs to happen to help reinforce that pattern of behavior change that we're trying to embed in their day-to-day? And, Kaitlin really did touch on that earlier around resilience being, less about that outcome focus and more about like that shift into the kind of the continuity of the practice as well. And that's certainly something in my line of work that I'm very conscious of, is how do we change the leader's behavior, but how does that reinforce the identity of who it is they're trying to become? And then that kind of drives that intentional behavior as well. So I just thought that's kind of worth tying into as well, because I know Kaitlin mentioned that earlier around that intentionality.
Yeah, that's really helpful. Thank you, Alexis.
Thank you. And we do have a question that's come in here from Brian. Or is it a question or a comment? Let me just read it again. Return on investment in a wellness program can produce a 6-to-1 return on investment. Harvard research. Yeah, absolutely, Brian. Thank you for sharing that. And the production can increase as much as 20%. So again, I guess it comes back to speaking the language of the person you're trying to get on board, right? And, Kaitlin also mentioned like the varying personalities and how people can shift and fluctuate or kind of choose to show up how they like as well. But certainly in a lot of instances, I notice when it comes to corporate clients, they're speaking metrics. So it's converting a feeling problem to a metric outcome for them. So how does looking at resilience through a practice like mindful movement convert to a business result that they're used to measuring. And obviously in human leadership, in my mind, I would like people to have a good time at work. That's, just experience joy and thrive in their work. However, that's really hard for me to sell to a leader who's looking at it through the lens of revenue. So how do we communicate that in their language sometimes is how we get them across the line. So Jen, I'm going to invite you on. Feel free to unmute yourself.
Yeah, hi. Really excited about this session. I'm often rolled into an organisation to do the self-care thing with staff when leaders sort of feel that staff are really under pressure and starting to react. But I notice that the leaders aren't actually setting a really good example. So I'm interested in how I infiltrate the leadership team around being human leaders, because I think, this is why I'm here, why I'm part of this network. But I guess what I've been inspired to do from this session is continue to, because I'm coaching quite a number of leaders and also working with groups of staff in the health sector, not-for-profit health sector. And it's not about revenue, it's about throughput, but there's still the same kind of pressures from leaders on staff on the ground to actually be resilient. Come in and do your self-care so my staff can be resilient. So I'm inspired to really encourage the mindful movement for the staff. I think it's going to be invaluable. I'm already doing a little bit of that. I'm a meditation teacher, but I'm very, very keen to encourage the leadership and use some of the stats that you've used today to encourage the leaders to think about their own self-care and set an example for their teams, because that's really where I feel the need is, to change the culture. Just my thought.
Trickles down, doesn't it?
Yeah,
absolutely. Thank you for that, Jen. And something that's obviously the main crux of what we're doing at Human Leaders as well, is really trying to dive into what are our individual patterns or values, vision, the way that we're showing up, and how does that infiltrate the organizations we work in. And I think something that is really interesting perhaps to point out is, and Kaitlin has so eloquently defined this, resilience is like this management of the unknown, right? And I think for a very long time in my life in particular, I had a very different view on resilience. How I was raised, my conditioning was that resilience meant pushing ahead even if you're almost dead. It meant getting through everything, just don't acknowledge what's hard and just soldier on. And I think perhaps, Kaitlin, you've already touched on it, I know this, but this idea that resilience is the whole human experience. It isn't just positive vibes only, and it isn't just smashing yourself through everything that's hard without acknowledging things that are difficult. And I love that your view of resilience is so, I guess, preventative of burnout rather than mitigating burnout or mitigating it when we're in the mess.
Yeah, for sure. And I think that is important, isn't it? That if we can prevent, if we know how we're traveling, it doesn't have to get to that crash and burn point, does it?
Yeah, absolutely. And I certainly, certainly. And I think that's, that for a lot of leaders is where they're let down, is that they don't see this as a preventative step. They see this as a mitigation step or a contingency plan when the wheels or have already started falling off the bus. And certainly, again, Jen, in my line of work and in my experience in consultancy, it's helping leaders connect the dots between what we know is important and what they need and how they're measuring what's important. So helping them understand how preventative resilience will be a cost saving down the track. And, unfortunately for those of us who feel so connected to this mission of the business being better for the human beings, we sometimes have to take a sidestep in how we explain that to people to get them on board with the idea, because they'll keep measuring it in their metrics because they're not inherently in that feeling side of things. They're looking at it through the lens of business. So sometimes we just have to adjust our language to speak theirs. but the content and the delivery and what we're doing is actually still, you know, driving our mission forward as well. But certainly for me, that's one of my biggest frustrations, is getting people to see the value in this in a preventative way. Yeah, and Jeffrey's just said he thinks that a lot of leaders see the recovery time as non-productive. And that's right. And that's why what Kaitlin's suggesting is building this foundation of robust health and cultivating flexibility in resilience as a preventative measure is a cost saving from a business perspective, because we are sustainably maintaining the well-being of our employees and ourselves, rather than pushing them to the brink and then, you know, needing them to then seek perhaps mental health support or take days off for burnout, you know, leave absences and all those things that do cost our business money. So I think it's an extremely pertinent consideration around such a small thing. You know, a 10-minute a day practice can radically help regulate our nervous system and bring us out of that chronic stress, which, as she mentioned, over time builds up in our system and creates a much bigger issue to then undo when we're in that, you know, constant state of sympathetic response to the world around us. So it's so preventative and it's so simple, but we just have to remember to do it. Nick's just mentioned, for me, it's about ensuring leaders are part of any program rather than imposing it on their staff. Yeah, I absolutely agree with that, Nick. I think any leader who comes to me and says, my staff need this, if they're not willing to be involved in the process, I'm not very likely to work with them. So I agree. And Jen's mentioned the same. Guys, I'm very conscious that Kaitlin runs a busy practice in South Australia here. So without holding her up too much longer, are there any questions that you would like to direct towards Kaitlin while we have her here? Again, Kaitlin, it's been such a fantastic session, and I can't thank you enough for helping us to connect these dots between movement and how this helps regulate our mind, body, nervous system, and how this in effect helps us to create that resiliency that we need to be better leaders.
It is my absolute pleasure to be here. And yeah, thank you. Thank you for inviting me to share something that I think is so important and important to have on the table and in awareness. And then I know you guys are, by the sounds, spreading this even further than my reach could possibly imagine. So thank you all for the work that you're doing and how you're showing up to support everyone in this human experience. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Kaitlin. And guys, if you would like to know more about Caitlin's work, her Yoga Brain 101, Kaitlin, is your next program starting in February for this?
It is, yeah. So the next enrollment for Yoga Brain 101 starts in February. So if this does feel aligned and you feel like you would like to nerd out a little bit more on the skills of psychological flexibility and how that integrates with yoga, it's an 8-week program. So yeah, there's more information at drkaitlin.com/yoga brain if it does interest you. But any questions, comments, or, you know, interest in this area generally further, I'm more than happy to talk about it. It's very much my area of passion and interest. So thank you for allowing me the space to share.
Thank you so much, Kayla. And could you remind us again, I love your podcast. Could you remind us again how we can access the podcast as well?
Yeah, so if you look up Wisdom for Wellbeing on Google Play or iTunes, Spotify, it's there. It should come up. So it's a series of interviews as well as some individual episodes where we talk through evidence-based psychological skills in a really holistic framework. So something that you can listen to when you're going to and from work or cleaning the kitchen, whatever life entails.
Beautiful. Well, Kaitlin, again, thank you so much for joining us today. I think helping us understand how movement is so important to how we cultivate resiliency and so important to how we show up as our best self in leadership and in life is so valuable and so pertinent to us right now. So thank you so much for joining us.